The morning air in Seoul was a blade of polished steel, sharp and unforgiving. Kang Dae-hyun felt it against the high collar of his tailored cashmere coat, a familiar chill that did little to penetrate the deeper ice that had settled in his soul years ago. As the most powerful Korean mafia boss in the city, he moved through the world encased in a trinity of fear, respect, and immense, isolating wealth. His shoes, handcrafted Italian leather, made no sound on the frost-kissed pavement. Beside him, a small, vibrant splash of color in the monochrome morning, his 8-year-old daughter, Minjun, held his hand. Her grip was the only source of genuine warmth in his universe. She was chattering about a dream she'd had, one involving a talking squirrel and a river of chocolate, and Dae-hyun listened with the detached fondness he reserved solely for her. His gaze, however, was constantly scanning, his senses honed by years of navigating a world where a friendly smile could conceal a dagger. His men, discreet and formidable, were positioned every 10 meters along their route to the private school, ghosts in dark suits blending into the urban landscape. It was a sterile, controlled procession, a king and his princess moving through a kingdom he owned but could never truly inhabit. Then Minjun stopped. Her small hand tightened in his. She pointed with her free mitten, her breath a tiny white cloud in the frigid air. "Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with a child's pure, unvarnished wonder. "That beggar is just like Mom." Dae-hyun's gaze followed her finger. There, huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed tailor shop, was a figure of profound want. A young woman, her skin the rich color of dark coffee, was wrapped in a thin, dirty beige shirt and a tattered blanket that offered little defense against the biting wind. Her face was smudged with grime, her hair matted, but as she lifted her head, her eyes met his for a fleeting second. They were large, almond-shaped, and held a galaxy of sorrow and exhaustion. And in their shape, in the delicate curve of her jaw and the specific, heartbreaking arch of her brow, Dae-hyun saw a ghost. He saw Sun-hee, his late wife, the woman who had been the sun to his frozen planet. The resemblance was not perfect, not a mirror image, but a devastating echo, a chord of memory struck with such violent, unexpected force that the air left his lungs. The sounds of the city, the distant traffic, the murmur of pedestrians, warped and faded into a high-pitched whine. The world tilted on its axis, the towering skyscrapers leaning in as if to crush him. His meticulously controlled composure, the armor of a feared mafia boss, shattered into a million pieces. His legs gave way, and Kang Dae-hyun, the man who made empires tremble, collapsed onto the cold, hard pavement. The first thing to return was the sound of his daughter's terrified scream. "Daddy!" Minjun's cry sliced through the fog of shock that had enveloped him. Immediately, the world exploded into disciplined action. Mr. Choi, his stoic and ever-loyal right-hand man, was at his side in an instant, his hand firm on Dae-hyun's shoulder, his other hand already speaking into his wrist communicator. The other bodyguards formed a seamless, human wall around them, shielding their fallen leader from the curious, frightened glances of passers-by. They were efficient, silent, and absolute in their purpose. But Dae-hyun couldn't process their movements. His mind was a maelstrom, trapped in the vortex of that single, impossible moment. The face of the woman in the doorway was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. It was Sun-hee, yet it wasn't. It was the ghost of her smile, the echo of her quiet strength, now shrouded in poverty and despair. He felt a phantom touch on his cheek, the memory of his wife's hand, and the grief he had buried under years of ruthless ambition and cold-blooded strategy erupted like a volcano. He was the unshakable mafia boss, a man who negotiated million-dollar deals with the same cold detachment he used to order the removal of a rival. He had not wept, not truly, since the day he had lowered Sun-hee into the earth. But now, on a public street, his breath came in ragged, painful gasps. Mr. Choi's voice was a low rumble in his ear. "Sir? Chairman Kang, can you hear me? We need to move." Dae-hyun pushed himself up onto one elbow, his vision swimming. He looked past the wall of black suits, searching desperately for the doorway. The woman was still there, her eyes wide with alarm, a deer caught in the headlights of a disaster she did not understand. Their gazes locked again, and for a second, he felt a jolt of connection so profound it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just grief. It was something else, something terrifyingly new. Her, he rasped, his voice raw. The woman, Mr. Choi, followed his gaze. The beggar, sir? The word felt like acid on Daehyun's tongue. Find out who she is, he commanded, the order laced with an unfamiliar desperation. Bring her to me. Do not fail. He allowed his men to help him to his feet, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the emotional earthquake. He scooped a still sobbing Minjun into his arms, burying his face in her hair to hide the turmoil in his own eyes. As the black car materialized at the curb and whisked them away from the scene, the image of the woman's haunted, beautiful face was the only thing he could see. The Korean Mafia boss had just found a weakness he never knew he had. Mr. Choi was a man of quiet, brutal efficiency. He did not question the chairman's orders, especially not when they were delivered with such raw, uncharacteristic urgency. While Daehyun and a shaken Minjun were secured in the penthouse, Mr. Choi returned to the cold street, his demeanor as impassive as the granite buildings around him. He found the young woman still in the doorway, though she had drawn the tattered blanket tighter around herself, as if trying to disappear. The earlier commotion had drawn unwanted attention, and now she seemed smaller, more vulnerable than before. He dismissed the two men with him with a subtle flick of his wrist, knowing a gentler approach was required. He approached not as a mafia enforcer, but as a concerned, older gentleman. He carried a steaming bag from a nearby bakery, the scent of warm bread and sweet pastries a deliberate offering of peace. The woman, whose name he would soon learn was Alina, watched his approach with deep suspicion, her body tensing. She had seen men like him before, men whose expensive suits and polite smiles were a thin veneer over something dangerous. "Excuse me, miss," Mr. Choi began, his Korean soft and respectful. He switched to fluent English when he saw the flicker of incomprehension in her eyes. "You seem to be in some trouble. Please, allow me to offer you some food." He placed the bag gently on the ground, a safe distance from her. Alina stared at the bag, then back at him. Her stomach ached with a hunger so profound it was a constant, dull pain, but her pride and her fear were stronger. "I don't need anything from you," she said, her voice raspy from the cold and disuse, yet possessing a clear, melodic timbre underneath. "Who are you?" Mr. Choi offered a small, disarming bow. "I am merely a concerned citizen. My employer, he saw you earlier. He was worried. He has sent me to offer you a warm place to stay, just for the night. A hot meal. No questions asked, I promise." Alina's eyes narrowed. "People like your employer don't do things for free. What does he want?" It was a fair question, one that cut straight to the heart of her harsh reality. Mr. Choi's expression remained serene. He had to navigate this with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. He is a man who has experienced great loss. Seeing your hardship on such a cold day moved him. He believes in karma, in balancing the scales. Think of it as a random act of kindness in a world that has too few. He could see the war in her eyes, the desperate, gnawing need versus a lifetime of learning that kindness from powerful men always came with a price. The cold was winning the battle. A violent shiver racked her body. She looked at the warm bag, then at the endless, frozen street. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all her broken dreams, she gave a slow, hesitant nod. The apartment was an exercise in luxurious anonymity. Located in a high-security building in Gangnam, it was one of dozens of safe houses Kang Dae-hyun owned throughout the city. It was furnished with expensive, minimalist pieces in shades of gray and white, utterly devoid of personal touches. To Alina, stepping into its climate-controlled stillness felt like entering another dimension. The sudden warmth on her skin was so intense it was almost painful. A silent, middle-aged housekeeper, introduced only as Mrs. Park, guided her to a bathroom larger than any room she had slept in for the past year. There were plush towels, fragrant soaps, and a shower with impossibly hot water. As the grime of the streets washed away, Alina looked at her reflection in the fogged-up mirror. The face staring back was gaunt and pale beneath her dark skin, the eyes shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. She was 23 years old, but she felt ancient. Dressed in a simple, clean tracksuit Mrs. Park had laid out for her, she felt like a fraud, a street cat trying to pass for a pampered Persian. Later, seated at a stark white dining table, she ate. She ate with a slow, deliberate control that belied the ravenous hunger clawing at her insides. It was a simple meal of soup, rice, and side dishes, but to her, it was a feast of staggering proportions. Every bite was an affirmation of life, a small victory against the despair that had been her constant companion. She was acutely aware that she was being watched. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them. The invisible weight of surveillance, the knowledge that her every move was being monitored. In the penthouse miles away, Dae-hyun watched her on a high-definition screen. He saw the way she held her spoon, the caution in her movements, the profound relief that washed over her with each mouthful of warm soup. He saw her clutch the warm mug of tea as if it were a lifeline. And he saw it again, the resemblance. It wasn't just in her features. It was in a small, unconscious gesture she made, the way she tucked a non-existent strand of hair behind her ear, an exact replica of a habit son he had possessed. A sharp, familiar pain lanced through his chest. Was this a cosmic cruelty? A test from the heavens? He was a mafia boss, a pragmatist who dealt in violence and numbers, not fate and phantoms. Yet, he couldn't tear his eyes away. He saw the strength beneath her fragility, the unbroken spirit in her guarded eyes. He was not just looking at a reminder of his wife. He was looking at a person, a mystery he felt a desperate, inexplicable need to solve. He turned to Mr. Choi. "Prepare the car. I am going to meet her myself." The silence in the apartment was thick enough to be cut with a knife when Kang Dae-hyun entered. He had changed from his severe business suit into a simple black turtleneck and trousers, an attempt to appear less intimidating that had utterly failed. His presence filled the room, a palpable aura of power and danger that made the minimalist furniture seem even more stark. Alina stood up immediately, her body rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. She had been a fool to accept, a fool to believe in karma. Now the bill was coming due. He was taller than she had expected, his features sharp and handsome in a way that was almost cruel. His eyes, however, were what held her captive. They were dark and intense, and she saw in their depths a profound, familiar sorrow that mirrored her own. Dae-hyun stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. The rehearsed words, the carefully constructed questions, all evaporated from his mind. He was face to face with the woman whose appearance had literally brought him to his knees. "Thank you for accepting my offer of help," he began, his voice a low, steady baritone. "I apologize for the unusual circumstances." Alina lifted her chin, her fear warring with her defiance. "Who are you? And what do you want from me?" she asked directly, her English clear and precise. "My name is Kang Dae-hyun," he replied, omitting the titles and the reputation that usually preceded him. "What I want is to understand." He took a hesitant step closer. "My daughter, when she saw you, she thought you were her mother." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Alina's defensive posture softened almost imperceptibly. She saw the genuine pain in his expression, the grief that was not a performance. "Your wife?" she asked softly. "She passed away 4 years ago," he said, the words still tasting like ash. "The resemblance, it is not exact, but there is something." In essence, just then, the door opened, and Mr. Choi entered, leading Minjun by the hand. The little girl's eyes lit up the moment she saw Alina. She broke away from Mr. Choi and ran forward, stopping just short of touching her. She held out a piece of paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright crayon, of a woman with dark skin and large, kind eyes, standing under a smiling sun. "For you," Minjun said in careful, practiced English. "So you won't be cold anymore." Alina knelt, her movements slow and graceful, and took the drawing. Her composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a clean path through the residual weariness on her cheek. She looked from the drawing to the little girl's hopeful face, and then up at the formidable, heartbroken man watching them both. In that moment, the powerful mafia boss, the homeless artist, and the lonely child were just 3 people, bound by a strange and powerful thread of fate. The sterile safe house slowly began to transform. It started with small things. Dae-hyun, acting on an instinct he didn't fully understand, had art supplies delivered, canvases, paints, charcoals, brushes of every size. He had expected Alina to be grateful, perhaps even intimidated by the extravagant gift. Instead, he saw a light return to her eyes that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with purpose. The first time he walked in and smelled the faint, pleasant scent of turpentine and oil paints, he found her completely absorbed, a canvas propped up on an easel, her hands and face smudged with color. She was painting the view from the window, the sole skyline at dusk, but she was infusing the cold glass and steel with a warmth and a life that he had never noticed. Her story came out in pieces, shared during quiet evenings when Minjun was asleep. She was Alina Davis, a promising art student from a small town in America who had won a prestigious scholarship to study in Seoul. Her sponsor, a wealthy arts patron, had died suddenly, and the funding had vanished overnight. Her student visa expired. Trapped, with no money and too much pride to call her family and admit her failure, she had fallen through the cracks, one terrible step at a time, until she ended up on the street. "I just wanted to paint," she told him one night, her voice quiet but firm. "It's the only thing that makes the world make sense." Dae-hyun found himself captivated. He would sit for hours, watching her work, listening to her talk about light and shadow, composition and form. He learned that her resemblance to Sunhee was a coincidence of bone structure, but her spirit, that fierce, creative, resilient core, was what truly resonated with the memory of his wife. For Minjun, Alina was a miracle. She was a gentle, calming presence who would spend hours drawing with her, teaching her how to mix colors, telling her stories about mythical creatures. The little girl, who had been so quiet and withdrawn since her mother's death, began to laugh again, a sound that was more precious to Dae-hyun than all the gold in his vaults. He, the formidable mafia boss, found his own icy exterior beginning to thaw. He started coming home earlier, forgoing late-night meetings to watch Alina paint or to read a story to his daughter. He was discovering a part of himself he thought had died with Sunhee. However, this profound shift did not go unnoticed. In the shadows of his organization, whispers began to circulate. The chairman was distracted. He was growing soft. And one man, his ambitious and ruthless second-in-command, Kwon, saw not a man healing, but an opportunity. Kwon saw a weakness to be exploited. The illusion of their peaceful sanctuary was shattered on a deceptively bright afternoon. Mr. Choi had arranged for a discreet outing to a quiet park, a rare chance for Minjun and Alina to feel the sun on their faces without the oppressive confines of the apartment. Dae-hyun had insisted on a full security detail, but even his meticulous precautions couldn't account for a threat from within. As Alina pushed a giggling Minjun on a swing, a black sedan with tinted windows suddenly jumped the curb, its engine roaring as it barreled directly towards them. One of the bodyguards reacted instantly, shoving Alina and Minjun out of the path just as the car swerved at the last second, its tires screeching as it sped away. It was over in a heartbeat, but the message was as clear and as lethal as a bullet. It was a warning. When Dae-hyun received the call, the cold, calculated fury he was famous for returned with a vengeance. He left a high-stakes meeting without a word, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. He arrived at the safe house to find Minjun crying in Alina's arms, both of them pale and trembling. The sight of their terror ignited a protective rage in him so primal it shook him to his core. This was his fault. He had brought this danger, this ugliness, into their lives. His world, the one built on violence and fear, had just breached the walls of the fragile haven he was trying to create. He knew, with chilling certainty, who was behind it. He summoned Kwon to his private office, a minimalist space high above the city, designed to intimidate. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Kwon arrived, his expression a perfect mask of concerned innocence. "Chairman, I heard what happened."
Un terrible accident.
"I have all our men searching for the driver." Dae-hyun walked slowly around his desk until he was standing directly in front of his subordinate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace radiated from him in waves. "There are no accidents in our business, Kwon. Only messages." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You have mistaken my changing priorities for weakness. You see the woman and the child as leverage. Let me be perfectly clear. They are not leverage. They are my line in the sand. If you or anyone else ever comes near them again, I will not just end your career. I will erase your entire existence. Kwan's mask twitched, a flicker of fear in his eyes betraying his composure. He bowed stiffly. Of course, Chairman. A misunderstanding, but as Kwan left the office, Dae-hyun knew this was far from over. He had drawn the line, and Kwan had just been dared to cross it. The Mafia boss now faced an impossible choice: abandon the woman and child who were healing his soul, or drag them deeper into his brutal, unforgiving world. That night, the weight of his life pressed down on Dae-hyun with suffocating force. He was Kang Dae-hyun, the Mafia boss, a title that had once been a source of immense power but now felt like a curse. Every shadow in the penthouse seemed to hold a threat, every distant siren a prelude to violence. He knew he couldn't protect Alina and Minjun by simply issuing threats. The rot was inside his own organization. As long as he remained at its head, they would forever be targets, pawns in a game where the stakes were life and death. He found Alina in her studio, not painting, but staring at a blank canvas, her posture radiating the tension of the day's events. He stood in the doorway, the words he needed to say catching in his throat. He had to tell her the truth, the whole unvarnished, ugly truth. Alina, he said, his voice heavy. She turned, her eyes searching his. What you saw today, that was not an accident. It was a message, directed at me. He walked into the room, closing the distance between them. I have not been honest with you about who I am. My business, it's not in shipping or construction, not really. Those are just the visible parts of the iceberg. He took a deep breath. I am the head of what you would call a crime syndicate. I am a mafia boss. And because of that, because you and Minjun are important to me, you are now in danger. He expected her to recoil, to see fear or disgust. He was offering her an exit, a chance to escape before his world consumed her. He could send her anywhere, give her enough money to start a new life, a safe life, far away from him. Instead, she just watched him, her expression unreadable. I know, she said softly. Dae-hyun stared at her, stunned. You know? I'm not naive, she replied, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. The way your men move, the deference, the fear in people's eyes when you enter a room. I knew you were powerful, and I knew it wasn't clean. But I also saw the way you look at your daughter, and the way you look at me. She turned and gestured to a canvas he hadn't seen before, one that had been facing the wall. She revealed it to him. It was a portrait, not of him, but of the three of them. It depicted him, Minjun, and her, sitting together in the park from that afternoon, before the chaos. In the painting, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was just a man, his features softened by a gentle light, his arm protectively around his daughter. His painted eyes were looking at her, and in them, she had captured not power, but a deep, yearning tenderness. This is the man I see, she whispered. Not the monster. In that moment, her unwavering faith gave him the clarity he had been searching for. It was not a choice between his old life and his new family. The choice was to destroy the parts of his old life that threatened to harm them. He would not run. He would cleanse his kingdom. The trap was set not in a dark alley or an abandoned warehouse, but in the gleaming, sterile environment of a corporate boardroom on the 50th floor of his flagship company, KH Holdings. This was Dae-hyun's true power, the one Kwan had underestimated. His empire was a complex web of legitimate and illicit enterprises, and he knew how to wield the clean parts to sever the rotten ones. He called an emergency meeting of the organization's elders, the old guard who valued stability and profit above all else. Kwan arrived confident, believing this was a meeting about a new shipping route, a topic where he held considerable influence. He walked into a room filled with stony-faced old men and a chillingly calm Dae-hyun seated at the head of the table. Thank you for coming, Dae-hyun began, his voice devoid of any warmth. I have called this meeting to discuss a matter of internal security. It has come to my attention that one of our own has been skimming profits, selling information to our rivals, and, most unforgivably, endangering my family to further his own ambitions. He clicked a remote. The large screen behind him, usually used for financial projections, lit up with a series of documents. Bank transfers to offshore accounts in Kwan's name, transcripts of wiretapped phone calls with a rival faction, and crystal-clear satellite imagery of Kwan's top lieutenant planting a tracking device on one of the bodyguard's cars, the same car that was at the park. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and presented with the cold precision of a surgeon. Kwan's face went from disbelief to panic to ashen gray. He started to stammer, to protest his innocence, but the elders were not looking at him. They were looking at Dae-hyun, their leader, who had just demonstrated a level of control and foresight that reasserted his dominance in the most terrifying way possible. He hadn't used thugs with bats. He had used accountants and surveillance tech. He had won the war without firing a shot. Kwan, Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more weight than a shout. You have betrayed the family. You have threatened my blood. For that, there is no forgiveness. He didn't need to pronounce the sentence. The elders understood. Kwan would be stripped of everything, his money, his power, his name. He would be exiled, cast out with nothing, lucky to be left with his life. As security guards silently entered and escorted the trembling, broken man from the room, Dae-hyun felt not a sense of victory, but of grim release. It was the first, most critical step in dismantling the prison he had built for himself. He had protected his family not by becoming more of a monster, but by being smarter, more ruthless in his strategy than ever before. He left the meeting without another word, got into his car, and told the driver to take him home. Not to the cold, empty penthouse, but to the small, paint-scented apartment where Alina and Minjun were waiting for him. 6 months passed, a period of quiet, seismic change. The removal of Kwan sent a shockwave through the underworld, a clear statement of Kang Dae-hyun's renewed and refocused authority. But behind the scenes, a different kind of work was being done. Dae-hyun began the painstaking, dangerous process of legitimizing his entire operation. He sold off the darkest parts of his empire, cutting ties with traffickers and smugglers, absorbing the financial losses as the cost of his family's freedom. He used his immense resources to invest in technology, green energy, and real estate, slowly laundering his reputation as meticulously as he had once laundered money. It was a war fought on balance sheets and in legal offices, a battle for his own soul. He moved them out of the safe house and into a beautiful home in a quiet, wooded suburb of Seoul. It was a house filled with light, with large windows that looked out onto a garden. The walls were soon covered with Alina's vibrant canvases, each one a splash of life and color that chased away the last of the shadows. The transformation in Dae-hyun was profound. The hard, cruel lines around his eyes softened. He still wore suits, but they were no longer the black armor of a mafia boss. They were the attire of a chairman, a father. He learned to leave his work at the office, to be present, to listen to Minjun's stories and watch Alina paint for hours, finding a peace in the gentle scrape of a brush on canvas that no business deal had ever given him. One crisp autumn evening, he found Alina in the garden, sketching the moon. Minjun was asleep inside, safe and sound. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. The air was cool, but he felt nothing but warmth. "It's almost done," he said quietly. "The last of the old partnerships will be dissolved by the end of the year. We'll be completely clean." Alina leaned back against him, her hand covering his. "Were you ever scared?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted without hesitation. "Not of my enemies, but of losing this. Of losing you and Minjun." She turned in his arms to face him. In the moonlight, her eyes shone with an unwavering love and acceptance. She had seen the very worst of his world and had chosen to see the best in him. "You didn't lose us," she whispered, raising a hand to cup his cheek. "You saved us. And we saved you." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about gratitude and a profound sense of coming home. The ghost of Sun-hee no longer haunted him. Her memory was a cherished, gentle part of his past, but Alina was his vibrant, beautiful present, and together, with Minjun, they were his future. The fearsome Korean mafia boss was gone, and in his place stood a man who had finally learned that true power wasn't about ruling an empire of fear, but about building a small kingdom of love.